This is the lecture called Presidential Support Staff. Now, the president uh, didn't always have the huge staff that he has now. In fact, historically, Washington started with no one and slowly added cabinet positions as well as people who could run the, the day-to-day operations of the White House. It wasn't until 1857 that President Buchanan got a personal secretary. Lincoln often answered his own mail. Grover Cleveland, probably because of the novelty of it all, uh, personally answered the White House phone on many occasions. And despite what Hollywood says, it wasn't until 1901 that there was a Secret Service, and that occurred after President McKinley was assassinated. So there was no James West, there was no Artemus Gordon. It's the reality is a little bit different. Now today, there are over 500 members of the White House staff that work in the West Wing of the White House. The East Wing is the residential quarters. The West Wing has the Oval Office, the press room, and many other things. Um, every little nook and cranny is filled is filled up by the people that work there. Now the numbers are such that the president may find himself inundated with support and help. And though the president is no longer helpless due to lack of assistance, he or she is now faced with so much bureaucratic assistance that he or she may find it difficult to control. So it's up to the people at the top that surround the president to make sure that just even the message coming out of the White House is the same for everyone. Now, presidents also suffer from another problem, or can suffer from another problem: the president's own attitudes. He or she might find themselves in a position, or might be the type of person who may discourage the staff from giving realistic advice. It may he or she may always be a person who strives for consensus rather than to hear a number of um, of input that is based on disagreement. He or she might spurn advice by those willing to offer it, and therefore doesn't see the world in a realistic way. On the other hand, staff may be overly awed by the president. It's like, oh my goodness, this is the man who won the most important job on this planet, and I don't even know what to say to him when he walks by. That kind of stuff doesn't help a president either. He hires very smart people, many of them from the very best universities and colleges in the United States, and he expects you to be able to do a job and to deal with him or her on a realistic basis. But this can happen both ways. Now, something also happens which might keep the staff from bringing the president bad news or being the person who always arrives with things that the president doesn't agree with. Too much of that, and you might lose access. People are always fearful of that. And because what that does is it destroys for them the rule of propinquity. Now, the rule of propinquity is this: it is basically the proximity to the president. The closer you are, and especially if you are in the room where the decisions are made, you wield power. You have power. People want to get to know you because you know the president. And so consequently, the rule of propinquity and the placement of people's offices are kind of a key to finding out who is an important person and who is a lesser of a person, at least as far as White House power goes. So people are always jockeying for influence. The office space that you have, the number of meetings with the president, access to the memos that the president sends out to be distributed to major staff. If you're part of that, you're an important person. You're a VIP, and people want to get to know you and be around you. Now, the organization styles of presidents seem to actually even divide down with some minor variations. They seem to be divided even between parties. Democrats like what's known as the circular method. And the circular method looks like a wagon wheel with a hub in the middle, the president, the Oval Office, and spokes going out from the Oval Office to the wheel itself. And those would represent aides, cabinet secretaries, so on and so forth. The the circular method was favored by both FDR, Carter, not Clinton, because Clinton we have a special designation for, and from what I've read, certainly President Obama, primarily because these people usually have not had any experience in the private sector. That's got to be one of the reasons that these people have held public positions all their lives, and therefore don't know how businesses run. Businesses run on a kind of a different system. So this was favored by FDR. It was favored by Carter. The president is the hub. The numerous assistants are the spokes. Now, this allows for greater access, but at the same time, it can be very less efficient because you're seeing far more people in this system than the people who are engaged by a pyramid management system. And that can lead to a couple different things. We know that, for instance, Carter took on so much, he micromanaged and lost track of the bigger picture. And that is part of the problem with the circular method. Don't lose track of the bigger picture. Don't get bogged down in the details. That's why you hire all these really smart people. Now, the pyramid method is favored primarily by Republicans. This was favored by Reagan and by Bush and by Nixon, where assistants report through a hierarchy and ultimately to a chief of staff and a number of very important aides who then report to the president. So whereas the circular method allows for greater access and more information to go to the president, the pyramid method allows for greater efficiency. But that comes at the expense of access and information. Presidents can be kept in the dark. We can say this was definitely true with Reagan and the Iran-Contra scandal. The president didn't know about it. His top aides had kept him completely in the dark so that he could honestly say, I didn't know about it. That's not the way we want to run our country, though. We elect the president. We don't elect the assistants that he or she chooses. Now, what they call this lack of access is controlled by what's known as the Palace Guard. And that was certainly something that was referred to in the Nixon administration. Bob Haldeman, John Ehrlichman, the Attorney General, John Mitchell, kept Nixon, at least at the very beginning of it, kind of not cognizant of what was going on with Watergate, but they certainly brought him in when things got hot, and the president was part of the planning of how to figure out how to get out of this mess, which ultimately led to his resignation from office. So, on one side, you lose with the circular method. You lose the ability to see the big picture. With the pyramid method, though, you perhaps can lose touch with the nation. And while those are the two primary management systems that we use, there's another one called FOB, Friends of Bill. And it was used by Clinton in the 1990s. And that meant that anybody who stopped by could usually see the president for a small amount of time. It created havoc with the schedule. But it sometimes happens, and Bill was one of those types of people. Now, appointments to the White House. So, for instance, the chief of staff, the picture up here was President Obama's first chief of staff, Rahm Emanuel, who is now the mayor of Chicago. And you can see Clinton's chief of staff, and who is now the outgoing Secretary of Defense, Leon Panetta. These men were given the chief of staff position in the White House. They do not have to be approved by the Senate. So the president can pretty much, and I think rightfully so, get anyone put into office or into that position that he or she wants. And the Senate can't say yes, no, we don't like it. It is what it is, because that's who the president wants. Now, at the same time, this man, the chief of staff, the deputy chiefs of staff, the counselor to the president, the senior advisors, and all of them are all given executive privilege protection. And this has been affirmed by the Supreme Court. And the most recent case of that was 2006, when the meetings between Dick Cheney and the energy companies, which had occurred earlier as they formulated Bush administration energy policy, the court said that any conversation that had taken place between the vice president and members of industry were privileged. So all of these positions receive executive privilege protection, even if the president isn't involved in the conversation. The privilege exists for their conversation. Now, the chief of staff and others also do not usually have to testify before Congress, since they have this greater degree of executive privilege protection. And the president, when he or she is looking for a chief of staff and others, are looking for someone who's loyal. Because these people, unlike the cabinet positions, work directly for the president. Once you become a cabinet secretary, you work for the president, but you also work for your bureaucracy over at state or defense or agriculture or labor. And therefore, it's important to have people who are on your side in positions that you see and engage with every day. So the big characteristic here is loyalty. Now, there are other positions that are important in the executive office of the president. You need to know these. This first one is the OMB, the Office of Management and Budget. It prepares the annual budget and reviews federal programs. Now we'll get and look at the OMB again in our section on bureaucracy and our sections on public policy coming up. But it's important. The National Security Council, the NSC, who the National Security Agency or advisor is attached to, coordinates military and foreign policy. It has increasing importance in any administration because of the rise of terrorism and the fact that more countries now have nuclear weapons than ever before. And so the National Security Advisor has been an important position since it started in the Nixon administration back in the 1970s. Now, increasingly, the CEA, especially with the economic problems we have, is also important. The CEA stands for the Council of Economic Advisors. It's a 3-person advisory group on economic policy. The original group that started with President Obama have now all resigned and are off to new positions. Timothy Geithner, the Treasury Secretary, is off to new positions. And so it's important that the president get good economic advice, and that's why the Economic Council exists. Now, there's another one on the Council of Council of Environmental Quality. And all of these have small offices in the White House. Now, the cabinet is a little bit different. Now, by definition, the cabinets, the cabinet secretaries run the individual bureaucracies that they are nominated to and eventually assigned to. The heads of the cabinet departments, from state to labor to agriculture to House and Human Services, Health and Human Services, and Homeland Security, hold cabinet rank. 6 others also hold cabinet rank. Those are the director of the OMB, the CIA director, the White House counselor, the UN ambassador, and the U.S. trade representative. All of those hold cabinet rank right along with the Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, and so on and so forth. Now, all of these cabinet departments, as well as the OMB director, UN ambassador, so on and so forth, are appointed with Senate consent. Now, the Director of Homeland Security is changed because Homeland Security, and I didn't catch this in before I recorded this, the Director of Homeland Security is now a cabinet secretary. It's filled by Janet Napolitano, so it's no longer a different position that has cabinet rank. It is now part of the cabinet, and everyone has to be appointed with Senate consent. Now, in a parliamentary system, all of these people here above would also be MPs in the British Parliament. But in our system, they cannot be both. They cannot stand on both sides of the fence. So any member who becomes a member of the cabinet, and we have a good example of this in John Kerry, who was just nominated as Secretary of State and confirmed. In doing so, he had to resign his Senate seat in Congress. And so because we cannot have a foot in the legislative branch and a foot in the executive branch. Now, this is also true of the president. The president cannot be a member of the military and at the same time serve as the civilian commander-in-chief. So we don't stride two different systems. Now, the cabinet meets regularly. Probably in the first month of the president's term it does. But the problem is the cabinet is there to run the bureaucracies, not to help the president really is not there to help the president make policy. The president uses his advisors for that. And the cabinet officials' interest, when they are there, they're there to help hammer out public policy. That's what their job is, and then carry out the president's orders when he issues them. Now here, our situation creates kind of a dilemma for the president. And the cabinet officials are and do have divided loyalties. The president nominates, let's say, Hillary Clinton. Of course, she's loyal to the president, probably up to a point, because there's a history there. So she goes off to state, and the bureaucracy adopts her. And so she's now loyal to that bureaucracy. But she also has to deal with Congress, because Congress funds her department. And then she's also beholden perhaps to client groups, which depend upon the department's largesse. And then, of course, there's all different sorts of things that divide the loyalty of a cabinet official. And this does not happen with those who work directly in the White House. Now, also in our system, the cabinet officials find themselves at loggerheads with the president because the long-term goals of that department may be very different from the short-term goals of the president. People in the departments know that the president's only going to be around 4 to 8 years. After that, it's going to be someone new. So bureaucrats, given some leeway by the bad legislation that's passed by Congress, have their own agenda. And many times that creates conflict with the president's policies. And another example of that would be that the president may want to cut spending, but generally, cabinet secretaries don't want to see the spending cut in their areas of coverage. So all these things create a little bit of tension between the executive branch Oval Office and the executive branch agencies. Now, the presidential influence over the cabinet is limited. Certainly, he can hire and fire his secretaries. But the problem is, yeah, he can fire appointees, but that doesn't mean that he can do anything else below that. Remember, most federal employees are covered by civil service, and it's very, very, very difficult to fire them. It's astonishing how few federal employees leave government service. It takes really, really bad things happening for you to be fired. And that is over 90% of all people who work for the federal government. So the president can only fire that top 10% if he so or she so chooses. Now, what are the factors in choosing cabinet secretaries? Well, there's actually about 6 of them. The first one, of course, is party affiliation. It's better to have people of your own party than people of the opposite party, but every administration likes to show a little bit of bipartisanship and nominates one or two people from the other party to be usually head of an agency that is kind of obscure compared to an agency like State or Defense. But it does happen. William Cohen, a Republican, was President Bill Clinton's Secretary of Defense in the late 1990s. Robert Gates stayed on as Secretary of Defense from the Bush administration over into the Obama administration until he was replaced by Leon Panetta. So it sometimes does happen. Secondly, there's interest group influence. Interest groups want to have a say about who the secretary is over the departments that affect them, like agriculture, labor, things like that. The third is now filling in some of the things that are important to the party: race, sex, geographical diversity, and finally, confirmability, which may be the most important thing. Can the person be confirmed? Is that person having or containing so much baggage that they can't? The president usually doesn't want to face those kind of prospects, because an embarrassing turn down by the Senate early in your administration kind of sets a little bit of a precedent. Now, sex and race has become interesting in this latest round because Charlie Rangel, a Democrat from Harlem, criticized the president for not appointing enough women and not enough people of non-white to the cabinet, which is primarily white men. But they do have a link with the president. It seems to have been Harvard and Yale that seem to be most important. Now, who gets appointed to federal positions? Well, as mentioned, a number of appointments are a large percentage. The number of appointments is large. The percentage is small. The president is never going to see all of those people. Again, the percentage is less than 10%. It's a large number of people, though. So presidents often don't know their appointees well, or if at all. They depend heavily on the staff recommendations, and he signs off on those staff recommendations. And then the background of the appointees is also important. Primarily, people go into government from private industry, from universities, law firms, think tanks, some from Congress, a few from state and local governments. So, for instance, Kathleen Sebelius used to be governor of Kansas. And most have had some federal experience along the way. And some have had some federal experience just before being appointed to the position. And then others are what we call, we've seen this term before, the in and outers. And this is the revolving door, going in and out of government to private sector to government to private sector. And of course, the problem there is just where do their loyalties lie? And we've already seen a number of them exiting the Obama administration to go back to the private sector. The vice president. He or she has only two constitutional duties. One is to become president if the president cannot conduct the office, or the president is dead and there's now a vacancy, and the vice president presides over the Senate, voting only in a case of a tie. So traditionally, it's been a dull, do-nothing job. Now, the FDR's first vice president, John Nance Garner, said the vice presidency isn't worth a pitcher of warm spit. And John Adams said about the job, the most insignificant office ever conceived. And Daniel Webster in the late 1840s says, I do not choose to be buried until I am really dead, in turning down an offer to be a vice presidential candidate. He felt much more comfortable serving in the House. Now, the job of VP is basically what the president says it is. First and foremost, traditionally it has been about balancing the ticket, but that kind of got turned on its head with the Clinton administration, he chose his good friend next door in Tennessee, Al Gore, to be his running mate in 1992. Hey, they finished first, so it's not too bad of a choice. Bush chose Cheney. Bush is from Texas, Southwest. Cheney from the West, Wyoming. Um, President Obama chose from the Midwest, chose somebody from the East, the Atlantic coast, to be his running mate. So part of it's always been about balancing the ticket. Now, to go back or to look at the job besides balancing the ticket, the vice presidents do things that are kind of unappealing. They attend funerals of foreign leaders, especially second grade level leaders that aren't worthy of the president's time. The president, many times, at least in the past, balancing the ticket was the most important thing. They weren't necessarily talented. The number of VPs that you look at and you go, who are these people? Well, it was all about highlighting a state in that vice president's connection to that state, rather than the vice president having any redeeming qualities that the president could use to make the office better. So after balancing the ticket, in many cases, the VP did his job. And after he did his job, the VP was put out to pasture, which means that he does some dull work on behalf of the president. Now, the central dilemma of the VP is, can I be a loyal team player who doesn't rock the boat? But at the same time, can I show enough independence to avoid being written off as a lapdog, especially if I want to run for president after my boss serves 1 or 2 terms? I want to be there. Look at Joe Biden, already kind of feeling his way along. And will he be a formidable foe in 2016? Very possibly, very possibly. So that's their dilemma. And why is it important? Well, 9 out of 43 vice presidents have taken the position of president when the president dies in office. The VP can become the acting president if the president is disabled. We haven't had that happen, fortunately. We've been fortunate in that modern presidents, starting with Carter, but especially accelerating with Clinton and then Bush 43, have made very effective uses of their vice presidents. And then this was especially true of Bush Cheney in 2000 to 2008. And then the vice presidency, of course, can be the stepping stone to the presidency. It was for Bush 41. And that was the last example of that happening. Gore actually won the popular vote in 2000, but lost the electoral vote. Otherwise, that would have been the last one. So that ends our lecture on the executive office of the president. Our next lecture will be on making the presidency safe and effective. It is already uploaded. This is the redo because I guess I had the sound turned off. So enjoy, study. Remember, we have a test on Friday. Good night.